Senior Center in conjunction with other people. Today we have as our guest Charlie Sparrell from Scituate, originally born in Worcester, he admits to 70 years ago, graduate of Norwich University in Vermont, retired after working with Liberty Mutual in Boston for 43 years. He's an active worker in the Scituate Historical Society, which has just recently opened up the Marine Museum down on the Driftway, and is open on Saturday afternoons on the first Saturday of the month, which will be, in this case, November 1st. He's a past member of the Planning Board and the Conservation Board and lives here in Scituate. Welcome, Charlie Sparrell.
About a year ago, in a weaker moment, I said to Rudy, you know, if you ever get in a real bind, speak to me and I think I can fill in on one of these breakfasts. And I forgot all about it. About 2 weeks ago, he walked into the Historical Society where I work on Wednesdays, and he said, I'd like you to be on in 2 weeks. And by the way, I'm leaving town. So Rudy, greetings wherever you are. Talking today about collecting family history, that we owe it to our grandchildren. Now, at least in my family, we like to tell stories. I think we all do. And I can remember after Thanksgiving dinner, we'd sit around and tell family stories. And if we talked about Uncle Sam, the stodgy old conductor on the Boston Main Railroad, my mother would beam. We get down to Uncle George, and she sort of turned pale because Uncle George earned his living on the night boats with a deck of cards. The old night boats were these steamers that ran from Boston to Portland and Boston to New York. And he earned his living. He would, with a deck of marked cards, he would entertain businessmen and relieve them of their extra money. And when it was said that when the steamer Portland went down, several of our cousins regretted that he hadn't been on board that day. But when I really got the point of thinking I ought to put some of this down, about a year ago, I picked up the phone, and a little voice said, Grampy, this is Stephanie. Is Grammy an immigrant? And I said, yes, Stephanie, your grandmother is an immigrant. And she said, well, I have to interview an immigrant for school. So I turned to my wife and said, your granddaughter wants to speak to an immigrant. And then a couple of months later, I got this note from my sister's granddaughter, and it said, Dear Uncle Charlie, I have to write a 20-page paper for school on the Civil War. Now, Mom says that you know about somebody in the family that was in the Civil War. And so I was glad to help her out. I wrote back that I said, Dear Alexandra, it's fortunate for us that the Confederate cavalryman's bullet missed, or maybe neither of us would be here. But I think for the both of them, it made it real. That, I mean, immigrants aren't just some strange people that are coming off boats today. And the Civil War isn't just something that happened hundreds of years ago that has nothing to do with us. There were real people that were relatives of ours that were part of it. Now, I think family history matters. Americans, we like to think we're self-made, you know. I studied hard in school. I worked hard at my job. I succeeded. I did it, all by myself. But if something went wrong, well, you know, it must have been the fault of my parents. Well, we're not self-made. I mean, some things we've done for ourselves, but some things we depend on. We like to look at our grandchildren and think that our grandchildren are more than just, they inherited more than our genes. I mean, my grandchildren are good kids. I think they've inherited, we've passed down values to them. And I think we've inherited, had things passed down to us from our great-grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, more than just the fact that my granddaughter's red hair goes back to her Scottish grandmother. I think there's something else that came down from her Scottish grandmother. Now, why should we be writing this down? Well, my grandfather was a great storyteller. With two problems when he was alive. I was a kid, and I had an attention span of about 10 minutes. I never listened to him. And the other problem was that it seemed to me that every story he had told 5 times before. And so I didn't want to listen. And now there's things that I would have liked to ask him, and I'll never be able to, because he's gone. I'm the oldest one in my father's family. I'm the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son. And if anybody wants to know something in the family, they ask me. And if I don't know it, nobody knows it. Now, I've got a computer. The reason I say I've got a computer is that it's possible now for me to do something, to do family history. My handwriting is unreadable. I can't read it myself. I can't type without making 6 errors in 2 sentences. But now that I have a computer, I've learned enough to do word processing, and it looks nice. Because you can, anything you write, you can change. I can't spell. That's why you have spell check.
How long was it taking you to do that particular thing with all your problems?
Well, you know, I can type that in about 5 minutes. Because, I mean, if I typed it on a typewriter, I would have 15 errors. And then the next day I found I'd said something that I didn't mean to say. I'd have to type it over again anyway. But you put it on the computer, you run the spell check, 2 days later you read it over again and correct all the stupid grammatical mistakes you made, and you've got something that's practically publishable. So now I've got the computer, now I can write it down. Because when I'm gone, the family stories I know are going to go with me, and if I haven't got them, nobody will have them. And if I tell you stories today about my family, and you think, gee, I got a lot better stories than that, well, great. Because if you have better stories and you don't save them and write them down for your grandchildren, they will never know them. Now, it's not as if anybody in my family ever did anything that was important. I think the highest elective office that anybody in my family ever held in the town of Scituate was a position of hog-reeve. Now, if you don't know what the hog-reeve was, when the farmers first started farming in Scituate, they found that there were 2 things that thrived. One was corn and one was hogs. So they grew a lot of corn and a lot of hogs, which was fine as long as they didn't mix. Because hog heaven, to a hog, heaven is a cornfield. And in the days before wire fences, pig pens were built of sticks and stones, And hogs are not stupid. And a hog with all the time in the world eventually could find his way out through those sticks and stones and into somebody else's cornfield. So the town meeting of Scituate, in their wisdom, passed 2 bylaws. One was that all hogs would have to be ringed, which meant you took an iron ring and put it through the hog's nose. And the other, what the town would elect an official known as a hog reeve. And when you went out in your cornfield and you saw a hog that you didn't know rooting up your corn, you grabbed the hog by the ring and tied it up. And the hog reeve, you went and called the hog reeve, and the hog reeve would come with a rope and put it through the ring in the hog's nose and lead it down to the pound by Gates School and stick it in the pound where either the owner ransomed it or the hog was sold to pay for the damages to the cornfield. So you see that the position of hog reeve was roughly equivalent in status to the present day position of town administrator. Now, if you're going to do family history, there's 3 things you need. First one is genealogy, and I'm not a genealogist. Gray Curtis is a genealogist. But what the genealogy is just the framework on which you hang the family history. The second thing you need is photographs. You have photographs, your cousin has photographs, your aunt has photographs tucked away in a drawer. Then you need to collect this factual history, which is who struck John and when, and then there's anecdotes, which are the stories that make it interesting. Now, genealogy sorts out who is who. I have a cousin, Jill. My cousin Jill is a genealogist. She does, thank goodness, that kind of work. It saves me a lot of trouble. She collects names and dates. She has books full of pages of who was born, who married who, and when they died. I think she's trying to work her way back to Adam and Eve. And you look at her pages and say, these were real people. They did things, but we don't know anything about them. All she has, and that's all she's interested in, is what she's got them captured. The day they were born, when they were married, the children, and when they died. It's in her book. She's not interested in anything else. So I take her, I'm happy to, when I want to find out who somebody was, I'm happy to ask her so I can build a framework. But I'm not interested in somebody unless I know something about them. And you turn up some interesting connections. Whenever any of us, my cousins or I, would complain about our names, I had 7 girl cousins, they were always complaining about their names. They want to be named something different. My grandfather would say, just keep your name and thank the Lord you're not named Janubith. Janubith. Who's Janubith? Well, Janubith was your ancestor. Well, it turns out that Janubith was born the 12th child in a farmhouse in Connecticut. And they had run out of names. And so they took the Bible and they let it fall open. And they stuck a finger in the Bible. And if you open the Old Testament, there's these long lists of John begat Joe, and Joe begat somebody else. They stuck their finger in there, and there in the midst of a bunch of names is Janubith. Never mentioned anyplace else before or after in the Bible, except somebody begat Janubith, and Janubith begat somebody else. And so from then on, that child was known as Janubith. So, you know, he fits very nicely in a genealogical chart. But I never knew. My cousin finally told me, well, he's your grandmother's grandfather. That's who Janubith was. Again, with the computer, the nice thing about the computer is that you can buy a program. It's called Family Tree. It allows you to arrange, without looking at the names, you can put everybody in there, a nice chart. If you write about Uncle Jack, all you have to do is say, look at the chart, this particular chart, and you'll see who Uncle Jack was. That was when he was born, married, and died. Puts him in the framework. But genealogy helps you organize this thing. I mean, if you're gonna talk about Uncle Sam, at least people ought to know that Uncle Sam was your mother's brother. Photos. Down at the Historical Society, we have boxes of photographs going back to the very beginning of, tintypes, 1850. Interesting people, fascinating clothes. People, and we don't know who they are. We don't know who they are. These people, I mean, they lived in Scituate. I'm sure they lived in Scituate all their lives. And you don't know who they are. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And cousins come to me with photographs because I'm the oldest in the family. They say, who is this? Well, maybe I know, maybe I don't. But the thing to do, if you have photographs, write on the back of the photographs who they are. Because these old photographs, you know who these people are. You know who your grandmother, you can, even if it was a picture of your grandmother taken in 1910, you recognize her. But your grandchildren, if that picture goes back in the drawer, and your grandchildren pick it up 40 years from now, they'll say, who is this lady? Now, this is my great-grandmother. And the reason, what you can do now, years ago, you'd have to go down to the camera shop, and they would take an old picture, and they would make a negative, and they would make prints of it, and it would take 3 weeks and cost $25, and the picture would not be anywhere near as good as the original. And a year ago, I went down to visit a cousin of mine on the Cape with this picture, the original. And I said, gee, if it didn't cost so much, this is our great-grandma. I said, if it didn't cost so much, I'd make you a picture. And he says, it doesn't cost anything. You go to a camera store, you go up here to Noble's in Cohasset, and a color copying machine for $1.50 in 30 seconds, they'll make you a copy which is as good as the original. And they are. They are. I'll pass around a couple because these are portrait photos and they're good. They're just as good. These pictures were taken 90 years ago, and they're just as good. The copies are just as good as the originals. And I've labeled them with the names, and I've sent them out to my cousins and my second cousins, whether they want them or not. I just took the list and mailed them all out. And some of them had never seen pictures of these people. And you look at the quality of those pictures, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing what they can do. Oh yeah, those new color photocopiers. Some of the old pictures are sort of sepia. Well, a color photocopier captures that tone. as good, you set it beside the original, you cannot tell the difference. And not just, you know, not just pictures of people.
Now, you had to stick it on this background.
Well, I just stuck it on there with,
I mean, this is thin.
yeah, it's, you know what photocopy paper is like.
Yeah, it's just
It's just then, you have to mount it. It's not heavy stock like a photograph. You really have to mount it. But if you mount it and frame it, you can't tell, with mounted and framed, you cannot tell the difference between the original and the copy. And you want,
This has only been lately they've had this.
yeah, as I say, I went down and had lunch with my cousin on the Cape, and he told me about this process. I didn't know about it. It's marvelous. It's marvelous. And then you think, you know, it's not an ordinary photocopy.
No.
It's a special color photocopy.
They've only had that for about a year.
Yeah. And not just portraits. Now, of course, the original, the copy is only as good as the original. And you'll see when you look at this. This is the house where my wife was born in Scotland. And the original is not that good, so the copy is not that good, but the copy is, as good as the original, and is the best one we have. Boats, houses, scenes, cars. My brother's an old car buff. And he said, you remember, Grandpa had this big old touring car. I wonder what it was. I said, I think I can help you. And I went and dug through a box of photos, and there was a picture of the three of us, about that tall, in front of this great big Hudson Terraplane touring car. And I took it down and had Nobles and had it copied and sent it up to him. And he was thrilled to death, not the fact that the picture of him 4 years old standing in front of the car, but that he had a beautiful picture of my grandfather's Hudson.
Can they blow them up, or do you have to?
Oh yeah, oh sure. Yeah. This is a picture of my father-in-law. It was a postcard size. And I've blown it up. I don't know how far you can blow it up without losing quality. But like any photocopying machine, it starts out at 100% and you can enlarge it or reduce it 1% at a time. So you're collecting three things. You're collecting genealogy, which is the tree on which it all hangs. You collect the stories. And there's two kinds of things. There's factual stories and there's anecdotes. And then you collect the photographs. Some people, you know, just some people are more interesting than others. Somebody was a clerk in my great uncle was a clerk in a bank in Worcester for all his life, you know. Well, he never did anything that was really exciting, and you just kind of skip over him. But then, it's my father-in-law. My father-in-law was born in that, the picture's going around of a house. It's called a croft. This croft was on the side of a hill way up in the northwest coast of Scotland. And when he was born in that area, nobody spoke a word of English. People wondered why he never had a Scottish accent. Well, the reason is he didn't learn English till he got to America. He grew up in a house, it was all Gaelic speakers. He worked, he was apprenticed in a granite quarry. Now people in the old days, in this country, Americans didn't cut stone, work in stone. The Italians did all the marble, the Welshmen did all the slate, and the Scotsman did all the granite. So he was apprenticed in a granite quarry in Scotland and learned to cut granite. And then one day, he answered the call of King and Country and joined the 42nd Highland Regiment, the Black Watch. And that was one period in his life of which we know nothing because he would never say a word. But after the First World War, he came over this country to visit. He had a brother living in Quincy who was working in the granite quarries. Now, West Quincy was all Scotchmen. I mean, the Scots cut the granite in the quarries. At least the Scottish immigrants cut the granite in the quarries. So he came over to visit his brother, and on the way, on the boat home, he met my mother-in-law, who was she was a confectioner's assistant, which means she worked in a candy shop in Glasgow, who had been out to Cleveland to visit her sister and was heading home. And they got married. But the only problem was that he took her up to the Western Highlands to this croft. And she spoke English, and she was a lowlander. And they spoke Gaelic, and they were Highlanders. And she put up with it for a few years until my wife was born. And finally she said, "John, we got to get out of here." So John said, "All right, we'll go to America." So they took my wife and came over here to Boston, and he worked in the quarries in Quincy. And you know, you can remember when the streets of Boston were paved with stones. He got a nickel apiece for cutting those stones.
The cobbles.
Well, the cobble, I think a cobble is more a rounded stone, but these are these square granite stones. They call them pavers, you know, paver. Nickel apiece for cutting pavers. He made enough money to buy a corner variety store. See, his wife had worked in this candy shop in Glasgow, and he was getting too old to cut paving stones. So they saved up their money, and they bought this candy store on Mission Hill, Parker Avenue, Mission Hill in Roxbury. We drove back there about a year ago. I wouldn't want to go up Calumet Street after dark. But in those days, you know, that's just up from the Mission Church. And they were all more Irish than Scotch, but the Scotch and Irish got along pretty well in those days. And they had a variety store. And they ran it until one day my father-in-law had a stroke, and the last thing he said was, "Mary, I want to be buried in my kilt." So they wrapped him in his black watch kilt and buried him. But, you know, those are the kind of people that makes it enough interesting so that I think my granddaughter says, "Grammy, are you an immigrant?" Well, yes, but there's more to it than just getting off the boat. Those are the kind of people, I mean, that I think your grandchildren should know about. And then there's people like my great-uncle, Charlie Sparrell, who started the funeral business over in Norwell. Now, the way he got into the funeral business was that he joined up with an infantry regiment and was sent to North Carolina. He was a private in the infantry. Well, if you were a colonel, in those days, if you died in Norwell, they put you in a wooden box. And he was by trade. He and his brother were carpenters. And if somebody died, they would make a wooden box, and they put you in the box, and they generally buried you the next day because you didn't, particularly in the summertime. They took the box down to the churchyard and they buried you. Well, in the Civil War, if you were a private and you got shot, they dug a hole right where you were shot and they buried you. But if you were a colonel, there were these traveling embalmers, and there was a railroad. And so if you were a colonel and you got shot, the traveling embalmer embalmed you and you were shipped home to Massachusetts and properly buried in the family plot. And so my uncle, having nothing, if you're an infantry soldier, every month you got about 10 minutes of terror and 30 days of boredom. And so when he was doing nothing, he worked for these traveling embalmers. He learned to trade. And when he came home to Norwell, he set himself up in business, and he made the coffins, and his wife made the linings. And if you wanted them embalmed, he would do the embalming. And of course, if somebody from Springfield died in Norwell, now you had embalming and you had a railroad, so you didn't bury him in Norwell, you could ship him home. And so the first undertaking business in this county was the Sparrell Funeral Home over in Norwell, which is still there, although it's long been out of the family. Now, then there are some family members that you just want to save, and they're anecdotes. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was so terribly crippled with arthritis. As I remember her, she was so greatly overweight and so terribly crippled with arthritis that she could barely get out of a chair, That was my picture of her. And one day, I was going to a dance. And she said, "Charlie, when I was a girl, I lived in Dorchester. And we used to get on the cars and go down to Atlantic Avenue. And then we would take a ferry across to East Boston. And then we'd get on a narrow gauge and we'd go to Revere. And out of Revere, they had these great dance halls. And my sisters and I and our boyfriends would dance until the last train back to Boston." And I looked at the old lady and I said, I was 14. I can't believe that. But now that I'm the age she was then, and every time I stand up, my knee starts to buckle under me, I can appreciate that stories of her dancing all night in a ballroom in Revere. And of course, there are the Rascals. Her brother, Uncle Carl, when I knew him, I was very young, and he fascinated me because he was a great jolly man, always a big hello for me, and I was at my grandmother's house and he came by, I was thrilled by the man. And he died. I was a kid, I didn't go to the funeral, know anything about it. But apparently he was a traveling salesman. A man who went a long way with a gift of gab and did very little work. And he expired in the arms of his mistress. And Aunt Edith had him cremated. And he sat in a box on Aunt Edith's shelf for quite a number of years. And then they were building Logan. They were putting in truckloads of fill, trainloads of fill over at Logan. My Aunt Edith said, "The time has come to get rid of Uncle Carl." So she took Uncle Carl over to Logan, and she dumped him into the fill, and she said, "There, you son of a bitch, you can do something useful for a change." So whenever I fly out of Logan, I say, "Thank you, Uncle Carl." And then there's a combination of factual stories and anecdotes. My grandfather worked for Norcross Brothers. Now, he was a contractor. Nobody knows who Norcross Brothers is today. But Norcross Brothers, they built South Station. They built the old Boston Public Library. They built the Custom House Tower, the Rhode Island State House. I mean, they built fancy buildings. And he was a pay clerk for them. In those days, because construction workers, you take a bag of money and you get on the train and go out to where the job was, and you get off, and the men were all paid in envelopes of cash. Nobody used checks, you just paid cash. So he was a payroll clerk. Well, he used to take me hunting. He used to hunt rabbits. He hunted rabbits with a .22 caliber revolver. He never shot a rabbit while it was sitting. And he always shot them clean through the head. And of course, I was astounded because I could just barely hit him with a .22 rifle if they were sitting still. And he said, "Well, you know, if you were a payroll clerk in those days, it was nice of people. I always thought it was a good idea to let people know what my hobby was, in case they thought they were going to relieve me of a payroll." Now, another relative of mine is named Ann Whitten. Let's go back. People in Hingham will try to tell you that Queen Anne's Corner is named after Queen Anne, the Queen of England. It is not. My first cousin, about 4 times removed, was a woman named Ann Whitten. The land up around Queen Anne's Corner belonged to the Whitten family. And in those days, before the railroads, there was a stagecoach. The stagecoach road ran from Boston to Plymouth. And it was a 2-day trip. And so you stopped somewhere in the inn. And she ran the original Whitten house. She was a great fat woman with a man who lived with her, to which he was not married, and 4 daughters. And the Whitten house in those days, they offered any type of entertainment conceivable to mankind. It is the most notorious place in the whole of southeastern Massachusetts. And because she was great and fat and a madam, she was known as Queen Anne. And that's why today it's Queen Anne's Corners, and it has nothing to do with the Queen of England. But I bet you, now, don't you have a story like that?
Oh, yeah.
You have people like that in your family. You do. You do, Jack. I mean, the rascals are the interesting ones. Tell us, can't you tell us a story? Who's the biggest rascal in your family? Didn't anybody ever do anything?
Him.
Yeah.
Most people won't talk about that. You have to really
Well,
dig that out.
I mean, these people, they're gone. They're not alive anymore.
The Baileys are still here.
Yeah, but I mean, the ones I'm going to write, the ones I'm writing about, I think you're going to make it write family history. You got to make it interesting, and it's those kind of people it does make it interesting.
You got to do your own and put it in the safe until you die.
I can't. My mother, bless her soul, I was up to see her last week. She's in an assisted living home in Maine. Now, she has trouble remembering what she had for lunch. But if there's a picture of somebody in her family, or several people in her family, and I take it up and show it to her, she'll say, "Oh yes, that's Cousin Bill. That picture was taken in New London, Connecticut in 1911. So, as long as she's alive and you can catch her on a good day, you can pick up some, well, the proper stories. She won't tell them but the other kind. But when she's gone, I mean, that's it. I haven't been able to write about my father. Someday I'll be able to. But, he's not distant enough. My grandfather, my cousins, my uncles, I've been able to write about all of them. But my father, it's sort of mixed. So, in conclusion, if I am not a computer expert, I do all the data entry down at the Historical Society, and they think I know computers. But we got a kid. If you don't know young Dick Tibbets, you know his grandfather. I've known his grandfather for 40 years. I knew him when he worked for Hugh Norton in Boston. That kid is a computer worker at the Society. He is a wizard. My grandchildren know how to do things with computers. If somebody sets it up, I can enter it, but I can't beyond that. I was born a generation too soon. We're all born a generation too soon to ever master computers. But with these programs, genealogy programs, word processing programs, you turn it on, push a button, and just put the stuff in, and it all sorts itself out. So that if you have a computer, you can do it. So you can do the pictures. And even if the stories I've told you about my family are boring, you have your own, which mean more to you and would mean more to your grandchildren if you put them down, because they won't sit still for 10 minutes now. But 50 years from now, if that material is there, some of them will sit down and thank you for preserving it. And with that, George,
That's great.
whatever time we got, that's it.
Yes.
Question to the speaker. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember Ernie Sparrell.
Yeah.
Must be some relation of yours, but he was
Right.
an undertaker and a representative when I was born. But I still remember.
Well, he's actually my grandfather's cousin, because it was his father that I was talking about. It was his father that was that Civil War soldier. Now they got signs down there that says that the undertaking business was founded in 1820. Well, what it was is somebody in the family made a coffin, and they got a receipt for it in 1820. But the undertaking business started when this Charles W. Sparrell came back from the Civil War, where he had been working for these embalmers and got to be the, and started up the business. And Ernest was his son. So that Ernest was see, Ernest's father and his brother were born in that house. That was a farmhouse, family farmhouse on Central Street in Norwalk. And they were both brought up to be carpenters. Well, there wasn't enough carpentry working there. So after the Civil War, my great-grandfather went to Worcester. And his brother stayed there and set up that undertaking business. So my grandfather was born in Worcester, and my father was born in Worcester, and I was born in Worcester. So my family, my side of the family has been in Worcester since the two brothers came back from the Civil War.
Any other questions?
You haven't lied to us at all, have you?
That's the brag.
You don't have, I mean,
Next
you
question.
got enough people up that family tree, you don't have to lie. You know, when you start saying your family were important, that's when you start telling lies. If you tell the truth about the strange ones, you don't have to lie at all. There's enough odd ones up there.
Well, we want to thank Charlie. The Council on the Aging, of course, has been the sponsor of the program. Bob Bellier from the Community Media One is going to talk briefly on the fact of the Historical Society dinner, which is coming up. And something that I'd like to throw out just for information is that back, he mentioned Calumet Street, on the other side of the hill was Jackson Square coming out of Roxbury Crossing. And the railroad was at street level about 100 years ago, way before my time, honest. But my father, who was brought up in that area, in fact I have a handwritten contract for the house that he lived in, was $3,600 to build this 3-story house, which eventually was 3 apartments. Whether it was right from the beginning, I don't know. But he came from a large family, so I sort of wonder if it wasn't originally a one-family house. And it was on the intersection, or just back from the intersection of Tremont and Columbus Avenue. Notre Dame Academy, which is Notre Dame Academy in Hingham, was just up the street, and you were on the way to Eggleston Square. If you went up Columbus Avenue, and up Center Street, you were up towards where the Giblins used to live in the fancy parts of Jamaica Plain. That's from Atherton. But the railroad was at street level. Now, of course, a train coming out of Boston at every intersection was a problem. So they raised the level of the trains up. And for many, many years, those bridges all existed. Now, what happened to the stone when all those bridges were taken down? When they depressed this railroad and they brought over the MBTA from Washington Street and tore down the L and put it under, recessed also. All the stone from all those bridges is now taking care of and protecting Franklin Park from people driving in on the park and wrecking cars and stuff like that. So in 100 years' time, there's a little cycle that a lot of people don't know that bit of history, and all because my father told me about it when, well, he died when I was 14, so that's a long time ago. So Bob Bellier is going to tell us about something else historical.
Thanks, George. Thanks, George. Just wanted to take a couple minutes and thank George Kelly for subbing for George Kelly and his socks today, for subbing for Rudy Mitchell. He has the wildest, I'm sorry the camera can't pick up George's socks today, they're about as wild as his tie. So you're really missing something on camera today, ladies and gentlemen, for that sake of argument. I wanted to share a genealogy story with all of you, now that Charlie is here also, that happened in my family, which is kind of unique. About 12 years ago in 1985, my dad had said to us as children, listen, get this week off. We want to have a family powwow and just get the week off and come home. So I've got a brother in Maine and a brother in Vermont and a sister in New York. So we all came home, and Dad says, okay, road trip. Everybody in the van, off we go. No